At 36,000 feet in a cabin lined with polished mahogany and first-class silence, a sound cracked through the air like a gunshot. A slap. Not whispered disrespect, not a passive snub. A flight attendant in full uniform struck Darius King, CEO of Apex Tech, across the face. The man had asked calmly and respectfully for the meal he ordered, and in return he got an open-handed insult that echoed louder than the engines outside. The cabin froze. Champagne glasses paused midair. Suits straightened nervously. No one moved, no one spoke, because they all saw it, but no one dared say a word. Darius didn't shout. He didn't retaliate. He simply pressed the call button, waited in silence, then walked to the intercom and said 5 quiet words that would change everything. We need to land now. What started as a simple meal request was about to become a global reckoning, not just for the flight crew, but for the entire industry. If you believe in justice, hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories that expose the truth. The air inside the cabin was unnaturally still. After the slap, Darius King didn't speak. He didn't touch his face, didn't even blink more than necessary. The sting on his cheek was real, but he absorbed it the way he'd absorbed 1,000 other microaggressions in rooms filled with polished shoes and expensive ignorance. He returned to seat 1A, adjusted the cuffs of his charcoal suit jacket, and quietly fastened his seatbelt. Around him, a tension swirled, not loud, not chaotic, but suffocating in its restraint. People averted their eyes. No one asked if he was okay. A few looked down, ashamed of their silence. Most just stared at their phones, pretending nothing had happened. Carl, the flight attendant, had vanished to the back of the cabin like a storm cloud breaking away. Not one member of the crew came forward to offer explanation or apology, not even eye contact. Darius glanced out the window at the thinning clouds, eyes tracing the horizon like a man looking for something he'd lost. Not peace, he'd never expected that on planes like this, but dignity, basic respect, and tonight even that had been denied. He remembered his father's words from years ago. The higher you rise, the more they think you forgot how to fall. But Darius hadn't forgotten. He'd simply learned to fall with grace and, more importantly, with memory. The intercom was quiet now. The captain had not responded to his initial request. A deliberate pause, a miscalculation, or was the chain of silence spreading even to the cockpit? A younger woman across the aisle, maybe mid-30s, shifted uncomfortably. Her hand hovered over the call button, then pulled away. She gave Darius a fleeting glance, her expression stricken with guilt, as if she wanted to say, "That was wrong," but couldn't find the courage to say it aloud. Darius nodded, slightly acknowledging her. He didn't need pity. He needed truth. And right now, the truth sat trembling in everyone's silence. The cold meal tray still sat in front of him, a cruel reminder of how this began over something so trivial, yet loaded with meaning. A simple request, a denial, then violence. It wasn't the first time power had been mistaken for arrogance, simply because of the man holding it. He glanced around the cabin, absorbing every detail. The folded napkins, the untouched wine glasses, the manufactured luxury. The whole space had been designed to make people feel important, but only certain people. Carl's voice echoed in his mind. You're lucky to get anything at all. It wasn't about chicken or mashed potatoes. It was about permission. Who gets to ask for better? Who is considered worthy of service? In this cabin, apparently not him. Still, Darius sat straight back against leather hands folded in his lap. He didn't need a scene. He didn't want chaos. What he wanted was already forming in his mind, a plan quiet and sharp. The slap hadn't humiliated him. The silence had. The complicity. He remembered the face of his son Devin, just 8 years old, with his wide eyes and steady questions. Why do people act different when you walk in the room, Dad? Darius had answered. Because sometimes they haven't seen someone like me own the room before. But tonight, even with ownership, with achievement, with more net worth than half the passengers combined, he had been reduced to less than a man. The injustice hung heavy. He felt it settle into his chest like a weight, but he didn't let it pull him down. Instead, he breathed deep, steady, and long. Let them watch, he thought. Let them see how real power responds. The jet continued gliding smoothly, oblivious to the rupture inside its walls. Darius pressed the call button again. This time, it didn't chime. Someone had disabled it. The insult deepened quietly. No alarms, no shouts, just calculated indifference. He leaned forward, retrieved his tablet from the leather pouch in front of him, and opened the security app that connected to his internal network. One tap, then another. He wasn't a man who acted impulsively, but he was a man who understood timing. The screen blinked, recording in progress. A backup from his seat's built-in surveillance node began uploading directly to his firm's private server. He didn't plan to use it, but he would have it. That was the kind of man Darius King had always been prepared not for the world as it claimed to be, but for the world as it was. Farther down the aisle, two crew members whispered nervously behind the curtain. Darius heard his name. He heard Carl's name. Then silence again. Cover-up already underway. Possibly. But Darius didn't rise to confront them. Not yet. He had made his request. He had given the airline a choice. Now he would let them choose how deep the hole would go before he began to dig them out publicly. His restraint wasn't weakness. It was strategy. The first move had been made, and it hadn't been his. It had been Carl's. And Carl didn't know just how far the consequences would travel. The aircraft floated above the Atlantic like a ghost. No turbulence, no bumps, just eerie calm. But inside Seat 1A, a storm was quietly gathering strength. Darius King didn't move. Not yet. He let the silence work for him. Every second that passed without a word from the captain, without an acknowledgement from the crew, without an apology, was evidence. Not just of one man's poor behavior, but of an entire organization's culture. They didn't know who he was. Not really. Sure, they recognized the name when they saw it printed on the flight manifest. Darius King, CEO of Apex Tech. They likely assumed he was one of those tech guys. Maybe they even Googled him once or twice, skimmed an article, saw some numbers. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was how deep his reach went, how vast his influence really stretched. Darius wasn't just a CEO. He was the architect of one of the most important cloud security infrastructures used across the U.S. defense network. Apex Tech wasn't just a private company. It held confidential contracts with over 40 Fortune 500 companies, 5 federal agencies, and 2 international coalitions. When Apex Tech sneezed, global markets flinched. And Darius? He wasn't a press junkie. He didn't post on social media. He didn't speak at tech expos or keynote festivals. He built quietly, acquired aggressively, and maintained leverage with surgical precision. That slap wasn't just on a man, it was on an institution, a walking, thinking engine of power, and the airline had no idea. He reached for the leather folder again and pulled out his phone. One swipe opened his secure network, revealing several applets humming in the background. His private legal counsel had already received an automated alert. Not the PR team, the lawyers. A second applet, one that monitored Apex's partner equity stakes, updated in real time. Darius tapped the tab marked vendors. A list populated. Falconer Air was one of them. He tapped again. 3 contracts. One for international executive transport, one for data courier flights, and one for equity partnership in an AI routing subsidiary. Darius had voting shares. He leaned back in his seat, his jaw tightening just slightly. What Carl didn't understand, what so many like him failed to grasp, was that sometimes the people you underestimate are the ones who built the ground you're standing on. He wasn't just flying on Falconer Air. He helped fund one of their engines. A soft buzz broke the quiet. His assistant, Malik, had messaged, "You okay, boss?" Darius typed back, "Quiet for now, but not for long." Across the aisle, a man in a gray blazer and wire-rimmed glasses watched him carefully. He looked like a corporate-type accountant, maybe private equity. He gave Darius a slight nod, respectful, curious, aware. That was the thing about power. You didn't have to flaunt it. When real, it announced itself without sound. Darius glanced around. Still no crew movement. Still no apology. Still no response from the cockpit. So he stood. Not quickly, not theatrically, deliberately. The moment his frame unfolded from the seat, heads turned. Passengers tried not to watch, but their eyes couldn't help it. Something in his posture made people pay attention. He walked to the front of the plane, not rushed, not angry, just precise. He approached the bulkhead panel near the galley and opened the secured intercom. "This is Darius King," he said, voice clear and composed. "I'm requesting immediate contact with the captain. We need to discuss the conduct of a crew member and a necessary diversion." Then he turned off the mic, stepped back, and waited. Behind the door, footsteps shuffled. Voices murmured. A curtain rustled open. One of the remaining flight attendants, older red lipstick, too bright against her pale face, looked at him like he had grown 10 feet. She nodded, disappeared behind the cockpit door. Moments later, the captain emerged. Captain Roar. Tall, gray temples, veteran presence. He had that airline look, calm authority tempered by 1,000 landings. Mr. King, he said quietly, crouching down to speak face to face. We were told you requested to speak. Darius didn't stand. He looked at the man without blinking. I was physically assaulted, he said evenly, by a member of your crew, in full view of passengers, with no provocation. The captain's face shifted, first surprise, then comprehension. We had no idea. Darius raised one hand. I'm not interested in explanations. I'm requesting that this aircraft be diverted to the nearest international airport for immediate investigation. Silence. Behind the captain, the second figure emerged, Peterson, head of in-flight security. Former air marshal, eyes alert, posture tense. The captain nodded slowly. We understand. Darius folded his hands again. I appreciate your cooperation. Then he returned to his seat, sat, waited. 10 minutes later, the intercom buzzed. The pilot's voice filled the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, due to an unforeseen incident on board, we will be making an emergency landing at Eastbridge International. Please remain seated and buckle your seatbelts. Gasps rippled across the rows. Whispers buzzed. All eyes turned to Darius King. But he didn't speak. He didn't even blink. He simply watched the clouds thin as the ground drew closer. They had no idea what was about to hit them. The wheels screeched against the tarmac of Eastbridge International with a jolt that rattled every glass in the cabin. But it wasn't turbulence that unsettled the passengers. It was the gravity of what had just happened. An unscheduled landing, a CEO slapped, a crew paralyzed by silence. And now every passenger on board knew this wasn't an overreaction. This was a reckoning. Darius King remained seated, his fingers loosely interlaced, resting on his lap. His gaze stayed forward, unreadable. From the outside, he appeared unbothered. But inside, every detail, every movement, every silence was being filed, categorized, and assessed. Because he'd seen this before. Not in the skies, but in boardrooms, strategy sessions, and shareholder meetings, where bias wasn't shouted, but whispered through policy. Discrimination rarely walked in the front door. It seeped in through cracks labeled procedure. Carl, the flight attendant who slapped him, wasn't the disease. He was a symptom. And the rot went far deeper than a single act of violence. Back at Apex Tech, Darius had uncovered systemic flaws before. He'd spent years rooting out inefficiencies disguised as tradition, racism masked as brand fit, and gender bias couched in culture concerns. What happened tonight mirrored every one of those battles, but now it wasn't software. It was people, in a system that protected the wrong ones. Outside, the aircraft emergency personnel waited by the terminal. No flashing lights, no sirens, just quiet coordination. Falconer Air was trying to minimize press exposure. Too late. His assistant Malik had already texted him a link. A 16-second clip filmed by a young businessman on board had gone viral. The video didn't show the slap, but it showed the aftermath, Darius sitting still, composed, while Carl stormed down the aisle, rage written all over his face. The expressions of the passengers nearby told the rest of the story. The comments were already pouring in. This is how they treat billionaires who don't look the part. If that's what happens in first class, imagine, coach. He didn't even flinch. That's power. The slap had sparked the match, but the fuel had been stacking for years. By the time Darius stepped off the plane, silent shoulders, squared eyes ahead, the media had picked up the scent. Camera crews weren't at the terminal yet, but phones were. Ground staff recorded from behind trolleys. Security whispered into radios. No one approached him directly, but they all watched. And Darius let them. Not because he needed an audience, because they needed a witness. Inside the terminal, Falconer's ground liaison escorted him into a private lounge. We'd like to apologize for the inconvenience, she said, voice trembling slightly. Inconvenience, Darius replied, not cold but precise. A man struck me in front of paying passengers. I requested a landing. That's not an inconvenience, that's a legal obligation. She nodded, flustered. Will of course cover all expenses arranged, ground transport. I have transport, Darius cut in. What I want is documentation. Names, titles, full incident report. Tonight, she blinked. Tonight, or I speak to the FAA by morning. Her lips parted, then closed again. Understood. Darius turned and sat near the far window, pulling out his phone. He opened a secure folder labeled Contract Integrity. In it were PDF copies of Falconier's vendor agreements with Apex Tech. One clause stood out in bold: partners found in violation of ethical treatment clauses may be subject to full review, restructuring, or termination. That clause had been written by him, and now it would be activated. Later that night, back in his private office suite at the airport hotel, Darius didn't sleep. He didn't pace, he wrote. One by one, he composed internal memos, not to PR or HR, but to Apex's legal department, the Equity Oversight Committee, and the Ethics Review Board. He drafted a preliminary demand for Falconier's leadership to produce all employee training records, onboard staffing procedures, and internal complaint resolutions filed in the past 24 months. This wasn't personal vengeance. This was a corporate audit, and Darius knew what he'd find. Because even before this incident, Falconer had quietly drawn criticism in diversity reviews. Anonymous airline forums whispered of promotion biases, racial microaggressions, and reassignments that disproportionately affected minority staff. But nothing had stuck. Until now. Because now they'd slapped the wrong man. Darius opened another app. A live passenger sentiment tracker software developed by Apex began to crawl. Keyword: slap Black CEO, flight attendant bias and justice. Momentum was building. He didn't need to push it. He just needed to steer it. Across the room, the TV ran quietly. A pundit on a business news channel spoke over a chyron that read, "CEO assaulted mid-flight, was race a factor?" Darius muted the sound. They were asking the wrong question. The question wasn't whether race was a factor. It was how often it was and how loudly silence had let it slide. He turned back to his screen, fingers still. At the bottom of the internal report, he wrote a single line in bold: "This was not an isolated incident. This is culture." Then he hit send, and the clock started ticking. While Darius King's actions moved quietly behind the scenes, the ripples of the slap traveled faster than even he anticipated. Across the country, in a modest apartment tucked above a late-night bakery in Chicago, 28-year-old Malik Jennings sat frozen in front of his laptop. The viral video played again on loop, Carl storming down the aisle, the passengers' stunned expressions, and Darius composed like stone eyes, forward unmoving. Malik had seen Darius speak once 3 years ago at a tech incubator event. He remembered how Darius didn't talk like most CEOs. No flashy words, no pandering, just clarity and calm power. The kind of man who made you sit straighter in your chair without knowing why. And now, watching the aftermath unfold, Malik felt something stir inside. Not outrage, he'd lived through enough of that, but recognition. Because Malik used to work for Falconer. He had been a junior flight attendant, still in his early 20s, just grateful to have a uniform and a paycheck. But that job had taught him more about hierarchy than hospitality. He remembered the unspoken assignments: Black passengers seated last, rarely upgraded, often randomly selected for baggage checks. And he remembered Carl. Carl was always smiling when management was nearby, but sharp and dismissive behind the curtain. He never used slurs. He didn't have to. His tone did the work. Like the time he told Malik, "You're lucky to have this job. Most people like you don't get past baggage claim." Malik had reported it once. HR called it a misunderstanding of tone. He'd been transferred to overnight routes within a week. He'd quit 2 months later, dignity bruised and disillusionment fully formed. But tonight, for the first time since walking away, Malik felt the weight lift. Darius hadn't raised his voice, hadn't thrown punches, but he had drawn a line in the sky, and that line hit Malik like a revelation. Someone finally stood still when everyone else sat silent. He opened a blank document and began typing. "To whom it may concern, my name is Malik Jennings, former flight attendant at Falconer Airlines from 2018 to 2020. The words came faster than expected. He detailed the patterns: the reassignment of crew members who spoke up, the coded language in scheduling meetings, the subtle rerouting of minority staff away from elite charter flights. And then he wrote about Carl, how his hostility had been normalized, how even senior staff laughed off his remarks. How Malik had once overheard Carl say, "We don't need activists in the skies." Malik didn't write out of revenge. He wrote because silence had never served him. And maybe now, someone powerful enough could do what he couldn't back then. He attached the document to an email addressed to a public inbox at Apex Tech. Then he paused. His cursor hovered over the send button. Would it matter? Would anyone read it? Then he remembered Darius's face in that video, the stillness, the dignity, and he clicked send. Meanwhile, in a brightly lit newsroom in Atlanta, investigative journalist Fiona Braddock scrolled through the flood of tips landing in her inbox. She wasn't assigned to the story yet, but she'd covered workplace discrimination for years. And something about this story felt different. It wasn't just the slap, it was the reaction, the hush, the fact that the man who'd been assaulted didn't shout. He acted. Her inbox lit up with a new message. Former flight attendant speaks out about Falconer culture. She clicked, then read it again. Holy hell, she whispered. This wasn't just a viral moment. This was a thread, and it was starting to unravel. Back on the West Coast in a corporate boardroom draped in minimalist elegance, a young executive at Virex Holdings, the firm that had recently entered joint partnerships with Falconer, held his phone to his ear, pacing. "Have you seen the clip?" he asked, voice tight. His superior sighed on the other end. "Everyone's seen it. We're not jumping to conclusions. I'm not talking about the video. I'm talking about what's coming. The man they slapped isn't just a CEO. He holds equity in 3 of our mutual contracts." There was silence. "Then send me everything you have." He hung up. Darius King's silence had triggered something no media storm could fear in boardrooms. Because now it wasn't about optics. It was about exposure. And behind the glass walls of corner offices and luxury conference suites, people were finally waking up. Inside Falconer's corporate headquarters, the air was tense. A hastily convened emergency committee sat around a long oval table. PR reps, legal counsel, and senior operations leads leaned forward as if proximity to the center would shield them from blame. "We need to contain this," said one. "Do we have confirmation it was a slap?" asked another. "Does it matter?" replied the VP of Risk Management, tossing a printed tweet onto the table. It had 2 million views and climbing. The HR director, a man who had signed off on dozens of dismissed complaints, looked pale. "We need a statement from Carl. He's disappeared." Someone said. A cold hush fell. The rot had never been so visible. And now people were watching. For too long, the system had built walls around itself, procedures, paperwork, plausible deniability. But Darius King hadn't attacked the wall. He'd pulled one brick loose, and now the structure groaned. Outside, a small group of college students had gathered with handmade signs. Accountability at 30,000 feet. We all saw it. Silence is compliance. Darius hadn't spoken publicly, but the world was starting to speak for him. It was 3:14 a.m. in Darius King's suite at the East Bridge Executive Grand Hotel. The city outside slept beneath a halo of fog, but inside the room, a quiet war room had formed, bright, sterile, and humming with strategy. The polished glass desk near the window was littered with devices, a secure laptop, a biometric access hard drive, and 2 encrypted phones linked directly to his legal and intelligence teams. Darius hadn't slept. He didn't intend to. He'd fought too many invisible wars in rooms where he wasn't expected to speak, let alone lead. And he knew one truth above all. When the system strikes you in the open, your response must be methodical, surgical, utterly undeniable. Tonight wasn't about emotion. It was about the record. He opened his laptop. The folder titled Incident 425B was already expanding. In it, the raw security footage from his personal surveillance node built into Seat 1A. The camera hidden within the reading light had captured everything: Carl's verbal abuse, the slap, the stunned expressions from passengers nearby, and Darius's calm, professional request to speak with the captain. He leaned forward, adjusting the timestamp, and selected a 90-second segment from the key moment. He didn't post it. He didn't even share it. He added it to the archive. Across the room, his assistant Corey stirred from the couch, rubbing his eyes. "You've been at it all night," he said, voice gravelly. Darius didn't look up. "We don't move until the foundation is airtight." Corey nodded, moving to pour black coffee. "We've got files from legal. Compliance says Falconer's training audit hasn't been updated in 3 years. No bias training completion logs. A few complaints marked as unsubstantiated, but most were never reviewed." Darius took the printed sheet, scanning quickly. Names. Corey handed over a second folder. 4. All former employees. 2 filed complaints against Carl specifically. Both were reassigned. One was pushed out entirely. And the HR officer who signed off still at Falconer, promoted last year. Darius set the paper down slowly. Document it, all of it. He turned to his secure phone and dialed an encrypted line. The voice on the other end answered on the second ring. Peterson. Talk to me, Darius said. Peterson, the in-flight security lead who had silently followed the captain down the aisle, spoke quietly but clearly. Carl's been radio silent since landing. He went home after a brief internal debrief, but hasn't responded to follow-up. We've also confirmed the cockpit didn't know about the assault until you called for the emergency diversion. Expected, Darius replied, and the rest of the crew, shaken. One of the junior attendants filed an incident report, but was told to hold off until they got official company guidance. Another one's been placed on standby without explanation. Keep digging, Darius said, discreetly, and send me the internal service logs for the past 30 days. I want to know how many incidents never saw sunlight. You got it. The line clicked off. Corey stepped closer. You think they'll bury it? Darius looked out the window at the mist-shrouded city. They always try. But this time we're 10 moves ahead. He stood stretching for the first time in hours. His bones ached not from exhaustion, but from restraint. Across the room, a new notification pinged on his screen. An email. The subject line read testimony from former Falconer employee. He clicked it. It was from Malik Jennings. He read every word. The details were clinical, restrained, but devastating. A pattern of reassignments. Repeated internal warnings about Carl's behavior. HR's failure to act. A culture of weaponized silence. By the time he finished, Darius's expression hadn't changed, but the path ahead had sharpened. This wasn't about a rogue employee anymore. It was about a systemic failure that had allowed men like Carl to thrive. He forwarded the file to both his legal and public affairs teams with the message, flag this for phase 2. Then he opened a separate folder labeled alliances. Inside were names of individuals and organizations he'd supported quietly over the years, civil rights coalitions, aviation equity groups, legal watchdogs. Darius never asked for recognition. He invested in power that moved beneath the surface. Tonight he began reaching out. Each email was precise, professional, and coded in his language. When truth comes to light, I want you ready to help shape what comes next. Within hours, replies flooded in, we're with you. Whatever you need. We've waited for this fight. And so while Falconer scrambled behind closed doors, crafting half-hearted apologies and pushing legal teams to patch a sinking hull, Darius King was already building an armada. By 7 Huzroad a.m., he had everything he needed. 3 video files, 4 witness statements, 2 legal clauses, and 1 cultural report from a consulting firm he'd commissioned months ago that had already found Falconer's equity claims to be largely performative. The rod had been mapped, and now it was time to begin cutting. He turned to Corey, schedule a press meeting. No interviews, just a statement. Corey blinked. That's it for now. Darius adjusted his tie and picked up his briefcase. This wasn't about a slap, he said as he headed for the door. It was about a system that believed it could act without consequence. He paused, then added, let's show them what consequence looks like. By mid-morning, the city of Eastbridge was wide awake, but in Darius King's world, the day had already been unfolding for hours. He arrived at the Apex Tech regional office in a plain black SUV with no branding, no entourage, no security detail. Just him and his purpose. As he stepped into the sleek glass lobby, the receptionist greeted him with a nervous smile. Everyone knew the incident was no longer a private matter. It was trending across every news outlet, with new footage surfacing by the hour. Anonymous employees had begun leaking messages from Falconer's internal Slack channels threads that exposed more than just incompetence. They exposed a culture of concealment. Darius wasn't surprised. He stepped into the executive conference suite where 3 of his top advisors were already waiting. They didn't need handshakes or pleasantries. This wasn't a brainstorming session. It was a strategic response plan already half assembled. Media wants a live interview, said Ava, his head of communications. CNN, Bloomberg, even Good Morning America. They're all asking the same thing. Why haven't you said anything publicly? Because when we speak, Darius said calmly, placing his leather briefcase on the table, we don't just tell our side. We shift the ground under theirs. Jameson, head of policy affairs, nodded. We've finalized a phase 1 response, a written statement from Apex condemning the incident, reaffirming our corporate values and demanding Falconer publicly commit to a third-party investigation. Darius flipped through the draft in silence. It was solid, polished, but too familiar, too safe. He picked up a pen, made 3 strikes through 2 sentences, and replaced them with one bold line. This is not a press issue. This is a structural one, and it demands structural accountability. Ava exhaled slowly. That'll make waves. Let it, Darius replied. We're not here to ride the tide. We're here to shift it. He tapped his tablet and mirrored it to the wall screen. A dashboard lit up contracts, vendor partnerships, internal initiatives tied to Falcon and its subsidiaries. This, he said, pointing to the largest node, is Project Axon. It's our global logistics and executive mobility program. Falcon is our primary transport vendor in 5 regions. Jameson narrowed his eyes. You want to pull them? I want to freeze them, Darius said. Issue an internal hold. Reallocate flights to secondaries. Quietly inform our European partners that all Falcon engagements are paused pending investigation. And if they push back, they won't, Darius said flatly. Not after they see what's next. He turned back to the table and slid a sealed envelope toward Ava. Inside was a confidential report compiled over the last 72 hours. It detailed internal HR patterns, hiring discrimination ratios, and an anonymous employee satisfaction audit provided by Malik and verified through 3 other former Falcon staff members. The numbers were ugly. Only 3% of senior operations roles were held by people of color. Internal complaints from minority employees were 2.5 times more likely to be administratively closed. In the past 5 years, not a single discrimination complaint had resulted in termination. Ava looked up. This is a bombshell. No, Darius said calmly. This is a mirror. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked to the window. The skyline of Eastbridge gleamed in the morning sun. Below, a few early protesters had gathered outside the Falcon building, holding signs, giving interviews, demanding change. Darius watched them for a long moment, then turned back to the room. It's time we stop asking for apologies and start designing consequences. At 11 a.m., Apex Tech released a formal statement. It wasn't vague, it wasn't sanitized. It read in part, what occurred on Flight 1621 is not an isolated error in judgment. It is the result of a failure in culture, a culture we will no longer financially support until significant verifiable change has been enacted. Effective immediately, Apex Tech is suspending all current engagements with Falcon Air and calling for a full audit of their equity, safety, and ethics protocols. The business world blinked. Stock tickers flashed red beside Falcon's name. Investment analysts issued immediate hold advisories. Corporate partners scrambled behind closed doors. The phrase structural accountability began trending on LinkedIn. Inside Falcon boardroom, the panic was palpable. We need a response, barked interim CEO Frank Maynard, his tie loose and forehead slick with sweat. This can't spiral. Too late, muttered the general counsel. What does he even want, someone asked. Silence. Because no one knew how to deal with someone who wasn't negotiating for silence. Meanwhile, back in D.C., 2 of Darius's most trusted legal advisors entered the offices of the Equal Opportunity Enforcement Board. They carried with them over 100 pages of documented complaints, witness accounts, hiring audits, and a draft petition for formal federal review of Falcon employment practices. Within hours, the paperwork would trigger a quiet but serious investigation. Darius didn't need to storm Falcon doors. He was flooding their basement. That evening, Darius appeared at a private roundtable hosted by the Business Ethics Coalition. Cameras were present, but he didn't look into them. When asked if he had anything to say publicly to Falcon he responded simply, I'm not here to ruin a company. I'm here to repair a standard. It wasn't loud, it wasn't angry. It was surgical, strategic. And the world was beginning to understand they hadn't slapped a passenger. They'd awakened a reformer. Falcon Air's headquarters stood like a fortress of glass and steel in downtown Chicago, sleek, modern, impenetrable. But that morning, the front doors were not the only entry point under scrutiny. The real breach was already happening behind closed doors in the conference room on the 32nd floor. Inside, the atmosphere was grim. Executives flanked a long obsidian table, scrolling through media reports, checking private messages, whispering behind their hands. The previous night's statement from Apex Tech hadn't just bruised their reputation, it had opened a wound deep in the core of their operational model. And now the man they had tried to quietly pacify was walking into the building. Darius King didn't bring cameras. He didn't come with a press team. He arrived with two senior advisors, his lead legal counsel, and a small leather folder. As he stepped out of the elevator, Falcon Ire's chief legal officer, Elaine Morgan, rose to greet him. "Mr. King," she said carefully, "thank you for agreeing to speak with us in person." Darius didn't smile. "This isn't a negotiation. It's a reckoning." They walked into the boardroom. Seated at the far end was Leonard Grant, the board chair, a man known for surviving a decade of corporate upheavals without ever once making a public apology. His suit was tailored, his posture upright, but his eyes hesitant. "Mr. King," Leonard began. "First, allow me to say no," Darius interrupted gently but firmly. "You don't start." "I do." A silence fell so thick it seemed to press against the windows. Darius placed the leather folder on the table and opened it. Inside were 5 printed documents. He slid the first across the table. Complaint filed in 2019 by Malik Jennings, escalated then reassigned. No follow-up, no resolution. The second followed. Anonymous crew complaint about discriminatory language used by Carl Tress during a training seminar. Flagged. Dismissed. A third. A July 2021 internal audit noting the underrepresentation of people of color in management roles. Filed. Ignored. He laid the final 2 face down. "These are recent. One from a current Falcon Ire employee, one from your competitor's internal HR whistleblower tip line. Both confirm what you've known for years. Carl wasn't your problem. He was your product." Elaine reached for the documents, her fingers trembling slightly. Leonard spoke up. "Mr. King, we hear you." "You didn't hear me." Darius cut in. "You heard the market. You heard Apex pulling contracts. You heard your shareholders panicking. That's not accountability. That's reaction." Jameson, seated beside Darius, slid a tablet across the table. On the screen was the internal network mapping of Falcon Ire's Executive Compensation Committee, one that had repeatedly overruled inclusion audits in favor of brand alignment. "These people made decisions that protected bias under the language of efficiency," Jameson said. "We have receipts." Leonard's face reddened. "What do you want?" he asked quietly. "I want you to choose," Darius said, "between survival and submission." He stood slowly, eyes locked on Leonard's. "You will release a public statement within 24 hours confirming Carl Tress's permanent dismissal. You will name the specific policies that failed and the executives responsible for ignoring them." Leonard's jaw clenched. "That's public suicide." "No," Darius said. "It's integrity." He turned to Elaine. "You will release all internal HR complaint data from the past 5 years to a third-party review board. That includes resolved, unresolved, and dismissed reports." Elaine blinked. "That's legal, King. Ethical's even more so. Necessary without question." He paused. "And finally, I want your next board appointment within 90 days to be filled by a leader from an underrepresented community with full voting power and oversight access." Leonard shook his head. "You're asking to rebuild the board from the inside. I'm asking you to rebuild trust from the foundation." The room was quiet, until Ava leaned forward and added, "You're lucky he's giving you the option." Leonard stood slowly, and "If we don't," Darius reached into his folder one final time and pulled out a USB drive. He held it up. "This contains footage from my seat's internal surveillance, the slap, the neglect, the response. It also contains a sworn statement from Peterson, your head of in-flight security. He confirms he was never briefed until after I activated the emergency protocol." He placed it on the table. "If you fail to act," he continued, "this goes to regulators, media, and your investors. I'm not bluffing. I don't bluff." Leonard sat back, lips pressed tight. Darius gathered his papers, closed the folder, and looked around the table. "You allowed this. You enabled this. Now you answer for it." He turned and walked toward the door. At the threshold, he stopped. "One more thing," he said without looking back. "This is not the end of my attention. It's only the beginning of your accountability." Then he was gone. In the silence he left behind, no one moved, because they all understood. They hadn't faced a lawsuit. They'd faced the man they'd tried to silence. And he had just declared war, with law, with truth, and with a power they couldn't spin their way out of. By the time Darius King stepped into his black SUV outside Falcon Ire headquarters, the cracks had already begun to split beneath the company's pristine glass surface. What had started as a single act of violence in the sky was now cascading downward, rattling through departments, exposing fault lines and destabilizing the very foundation of the airline's internal culture. Back in the boardroom, silence lingered long after Darius left. Leonard Grant remained seated, his expression vacant, as the others around him scrambled to make sense of what had just occurred. The folder Darius had placed on the table still sat unopened beside the USB drive. No one dared touch it, until Elaine finally did. She plugged the drive into her secure laptop. For the next 5 minutes, the room was forced to watch the moment Carl Tress slapped Darius across the face. Not from a viral phone video, not from secondhand accounts, but from a crystal-clear overhead security angle. No sound, just movement. Carl's approach, his posture, his words, though silent, clearly loaded. The moment his hand rose, the exact second it fell, and Darius still, controlled, unmoved. By the time the video ended, Elaine's voice cracked. This will break us. No, said the general counsel softly. This will reveal us. The next 48 hours would send Falconer into freefall. It began with the internal cascade. After Darius's confrontation, the airline's own legal department began quietly forwarding old reports to external auditors. Some dated back as far as 2015. Reports labeled minor interpersonal conflict were revealed to include racial slurs. Performance reviews labeled needs attitude adjustment correlated almost exclusively with employees of color. One HR associate newly hired and unfamiliar with the company's legacy flagged a shocking trend. 78% of all internal complaints involving racial bias were marked informally resolved with no documentation or follow-up. That data was leaked anonymously to a journalist within hours. Fiona Braddock, who had already received Malik's testimony, was the first to break the story. Leaked docs show Falconer ignored racial complaints for years. The headline hit the internet like a thunderclap. That afternoon, a second whistleblower stepped forward, a former senior training officer, who revealed that Carl Tress had been flagged in 3 separate internal reports, but was repeatedly shielded by a regional VP who cited legacy loyalty as the reason for dismissal denial. The VP resigned before the close of business. Within 24 hours, 6 more resignations followed. The next morning, Falconer's stock dropped 11%. Their public relations team scrambled to release a new statement, one that included remorse listening and path to healing, but without naming Carl or Darius or the policies under review. It backfired instantly. Social media turned on them. Hashtags surged, say his name slap. In the skies we fly with justice. More damaging than the public's anger was the industry's silence. No major partners defended Falconer. No suppliers issued statements of support. Everyone was waiting to see which way the wind would blow. And Darius had already built the wind tunnel. In D.C., the Equal Opportunity Enforcement Board officially opened a Title VII investigation into Falconer's internal labor practices. The move triggered automatic compliance reviews across 5 federal transportation agencies. At the same time, the Civil Aviation Oversight Commission launched a full audit into Falconer's training programs, pilot conduct standards, and disciplinary processes. The announcement was delivered quietly, but its meaning was deafening. Inside Apex Tech's crisis strategy room, Darius reviewed every development without celebration. He didn't flinch when the stock fell. He didn't smile when executives resigned. Instead, he watched, measured, directed. When asked by his team if he wanted to do interviews, now go public issue statements, he said, "Not yet," because the storm was still forming. He knew how systems collapsed. He'd dismantled failing infrastructures before, just not ones made of humans, power, and silence. Now he was watching this one fold, not through destruction, but through exposure. The next fracture came from the inside. 3 current Falconer employees, 1 flight attendant, 1 HR associate, and 1 logistics manager, held a private press conference with legal representation. Their claims echoed everything Darius had uncovered: patterns of retaliation, diversity quotas used for optics, but not inclusion. A promotion track that quietly excluded anyone who challenged cultural cohesion. The headline the next day was brutal. Inside the airline where racism took flight. That same morning, 2 major vendors, an aircraft maintenance firm and a scheduling software partner, announced they were suspending collaboration with Falconer pending the investigation's outcome. By week's end, internal Slack channels had turned into war zones of opinion. Employees demanded leadership changes. A petition circulated signed by over 100-200 employees calling for an independent ombudsman, cultural reform, and the resignation of multiple senior leaders. When the petition leaked, shareholders demanded an emergency meeting, and Leonard Grant, he stayed silent. The man who once prided himself on steady hands was now cornered by consequence. At 3:00 a.m., 4 days after the slap, Darius sat in his office watching the city blink beneath a silver-gray sky. Behind him, screens played silent loops of news anchors dissecting every frame of the incident. He didn't need to hear them. He had his own report. Ava stepped into the room holding a document. "They're collapsing from within," she said. Darius nodded. "Then we don't push." "Why not?" Because the next part he said, "Eyes steady," is where they asked for help. He didn't need to bring Falconer down. He had already made the truth louder than their denial. And now the system built to protect itself was caving in, from the inside out. Monday morning arrived not with fanfare, but with a press release. At 8:00 a.m., sharp Falconer Air issued a statement unlike any they had released before. It wasn't filtered through PR euphemisms or sanitized by legal language. It was signed personally by Leonard Grant, who for the first time since the scandal broke, stepped into the light. The headline read, "Falconer accepts responsibility, commits to full organizational restructuring, effective immediately." And beneath it, a sentence that no one had expected: "We failed. Not once, but systemically." And now we begin again. It wasn't just a shift in language. It was a shift in posture. Effective that same day. Carl Tress's employment was officially terminated and his FAA certification revoked. Elaine Morgan and 2 additional senior executives voluntarily stepped down. Falconer's Diversity, Equity, and Ethics Office was dissolved and rebuilt under independent oversight. A national recruitment campaign launched for a new board member of public accountability, one chosen by external civil rights groups, not the board itself. An emergency budget was allocated to provide training for every employee, including the C-suite, under the leadership of the newly formed Equity Review Commission. But the most remarkable change came in the form of a second announcement delivered not by Falconer, but by Apex Tech. That same hour, Darius King took the stage at a closed-door summit hosted by the Business Aviation Policy Forum. There were no cameras, no branding, just a single spotlight in a room filled with decision-makers, regulators, and CEOs from every major airline in North America. Darius stood before them in a charcoal gray suit, calm, measured, controlled. The issue he began was never about a slap. It was about what made someone feel that slap was acceptable. He paused, allowing the words to settle. "For years, we've flown at 30,000 feet while leaving humanity on the tarmac. We've talked about service, excellence, leadership, but we've forgotten dignity. And I'm not interested in accountability that fades after a headline. I'm interested in infrastructure that outlasts outrage." He didn't speak long. He didn't need to. When he finished, there was no applause, just silence, the kind that meant people were finally listening. Inside Falconer headquarters, things looked different. The glass conference rooms, once symbols of power, had become places of dialogue. For the first time, junior staff were invited into meetings that had previously been reserved for directors. Anonymous reporting systems had been upgraded and made transparent. A third-party review team comprising labor rights advocates, civil rights attorneys, and 2 former federal ethics officers began evaluating every aspect of Falconer's operational model. One of them, Isaiah Thomas, a rising voice in corporate ethics reform, had been appointed Director of Cultural Transformation. His first act, re-interviewing every employee who had filed a complaint in the past 5 years. Not to punish, but to listen. "I don't want people to be scared of making noise," Isaiah said in his first internal newsletter. "I want us to be scared of staying quiet." The tone had changed. In the cafeteria, a whiteboard appeared blank at first, then slowly filled with handwritten notes from anonymous staff. "This week I was heard. It's not perfect, but it's starting to feel safe. For the first time, I don't feel invisible." 2 weeks later, Darius returned to Falconer. Not as a passenger, as a consultant. He didn't announce it publicly. The press was never informed. But internally, his name was listed on the boardroom schedule advisory session, King Review Phase 1. His role wasn't symbolic. It was systemic. He worked directly with the audit team to identify cultural blind spots, partner with a third-party evaluators, and outline long-term strategies for equitable hiring, crew evaluations, and conflict response protocols. During one session, a junior logistics manager asked him, "Why are you here after everything?" Darius smiled, not smugly, but quietly. "Because fixing it from the outside isn't enough," he said. "You have to walk through the rubble if you want to help rebuild the house." And rebuild they did. Falconire restructured its entire leadership evaluation matrix, tying executive performance bonuses directly to cultural cohesion metrics. It introduced anonymous climate checks every quarter, mandating the board to respond publicly to internal trends. A digital dashboard was installed in every regional office, a live transparency feed showing complaint statuses, demographic data, and hiring and equity benchmarks. Darius never signed a contract. He never took a paycheck. He simply showed up every week without fail and stayed until the work was done. It didn't happen overnight, but it happened. And the airline wasn't the only thing that changed. Other companies, transportation, tech, hospitality, took notice. Quietly, they began requesting copies of Falconire's reform blueprint, not because they were under fire, but because they saw what was possible when silence was broken and dignity was defended. And so the slap that had once echoed in the stillness of a luxury jet now echoed through policy rooms, training modules, hiring boards, and public trust. Not as shame, but as the beginning of a reckoning. 3 months after the emergency landing that shook the airline industry, Falconire's quarterly report landed on the desks of its board and major investors. For years, these reports had followed a familiar script: safe growth, tempered projections, and footnotes buried in legal language. But this report was different, not just in content, but in tone. Across 138 pages, it detailed the internal collapse and the rebuilding that followed. Not a single paragraph tried to spin the truth. Instead, it did what corporate documents almost never do. It admitted failure and traced every ripple of consequence that followed. And there were many. The first came in the form of executive attrition. In the 10 weeks following the slap, Falconire's entire mid-level operations leadership had been reshuffled. 3 regional managers were let go. 2 resigned quietly. One, responsible for rerouting multiple internal complaints to priority review queues that never existed, was publicly terminated. The company's HR chain, once staffed by culture-first strategists with no background in civil rights law, was restructured under new leadership with direct reporting lines to the board's newly created Ethics Oversight Committee. Each departure triggered investor questions. Each answer led to deeper reforms. And yet something remarkable happened. Falconire's customer retention rate held. Despite the storm, despite the scandal, passengers stayed. In fact, internal polling showed a 12% increase in brand favorability among Black, Hispanic, and Asian American passengers, who viewed the reforms as a model of transparency in crisis. Why? Because for the first time, a company didn't deflect. It transformed. And at the center of it all, though never taking credit, was Darius King. He hadn't appeared in any press photos. He hadn't granted any interviews. But internally, he had become a cornerstone of change. In the executive wing of Apex Tech, Darius reviewed a second report, this one from his own internal research team. They'd completed an analysis of how Falconire's handling of the crisis had impacted partner companies' market trust and public perception. The findings were precise. 3 competing airlines had quietly launched diversity audits of their own staff, fearful of becoming the next Falconire. At least 5 major corporations had begun consulting with civil rights experts before approving new vendor contracts. And across multiple Fortune 100 boardrooms, the name Darius King had become shorthand, not for scandal, but for standard. "He's a compliance risk," one executive was reported to have said. "No," another replied, "he's an accountability check." Darius had never asked for that role, but he'd accepted it when silence failed him. At Falconire, internal culture surveys, previously generic and ignored, were now distributed anonymously with mandated quarterly reviews. The results were transparent and at first brutal. Less than 30% of employees believed their managers handled discrimination complaints seriously. Only 12% believed internal investigations were fair. These numbers weren't hidden. They were presented at a company-wide town hall live-streamed across departments. And sitting front row were Leonard Grant and the remaining board members watching as Isaiah Thomas, the new director of cultural transformation, presented every hard truth with unflinching honesty. Afterward, Leonard stood and said something no one had ever heard in a Falconire office. "We weren't just unaware. We were unwilling. That ends now." The following week, for the first time in Falconer history, Leonard invited employees of every level from junior crew to maintenance to submit anonymous reform proposals. Over 600 were received. 30 were implemented within a month. Among them, a rotating employee advisory council with veto power on culture-related executive decisions. A mandatory crew-wide cultural competency module reviewed by a panel of racial equity experts. And a program called See It, allowing any employee to report incidents, bias abuse, or retaliation through an encrypted third-party platform with real-time updates on investigative progress. Internally, morale began to shift. Small moments told the story better than metrics. In the crew lounge of Terminal 3, someone posted a hand-lettered sign. "We saw what happened. We changed because someone didn't back down." Elsewhere, structural consequences unfolded beyond Falconer. At the Federal Transportation Committee, Senator Roland Pierce, once skeptical of pushing corporate boards too hard, introduced a new bill, the Aviation Workplace Transparency Act. It required all airlines operating in U.S. airspace to submit annual diversity audits, third-party complaint resolution statistics, and public accountability scores. The bill passed the subcommittee with bipartisan support. Falconer's cooperation and reform became a central talking point. The chairman who once resisted Darius's demands was now testifying on Capitol Hill about their impact. "We were wrong," Leonard Grant said under oath. "But the right man confronted us and we listened, because we had no choice." Back in Chicago during a private lunch, Darius met quietly with Isaiah Thomas and a few new hires who'd come through Falconer's revamped recruitment initiative. One of them, a Latina flight attendant named Camilla, said, "I never thought I'd feel safe working for a company like this." Darius smiled slightly. Safety shouldn't be a surprise. It should be the standard. Later, as he stepped into the elevator, Isaiah stopped him. "Did you ever think this would all work?" Darius didn't hesitate. "It didn't work," he said. "It's working. There's a difference." The elevator doors closed, but the legacy of consequence remained etched into policies, procedures, and people finally empowered to speak. The system had cracked, and out of those cracks, something new was taking root. It started quietly, an unexpected resignation email at 6:23 a.m. from Falconer's longtime chief operating officer, then another from a senior VP in human capital strategy by 9:00 a.m. Both cited new opportunities and personal growth, but internally no one believed those euphemisms anymore. They were retreating. Because for the first time, the traditional centers of unchecked authority, the ones who had ruled from polished offices immune to consequence, were no longer protected by silence or loyalty. They were exposed. And the people who once stood powerless now held the keys. The reversal wasn't dramatic. It didn't arrive with media cameras or fiery speeches. It unfolded in subtler, more significant ways. Committee votes shifting hiring approvals, rerouted strategic plans needing new sign-offs from departments once ignored. Take Tanya Reeves, a former mid-level training supervisor who had been sidelined for overreaching when she proposed a bias mitigation module for onboarding. Just last year, she'd been transferred to a regional training hub in Tulsa, far from the executive conversations that once filled her inbox. But now she sat at the head of Falconer's Re-Education and Cultural Impact Division. Promoted, reinstated, and placed on the Executive Strategy Council at the direct recommendation of Darius King. The same people who once wrote her off as too political now deferred to her in every meeting on workplace culture. During her first executive workshop, Tanya began by putting a single slide on the screen. "If you ever called me a problem, you are now required to call me the solution." There was no applause. There didn't need to be. The truth sat heavier than celebration. Meanwhile, in Apex Tech's neutral briefing chamber, a room Darius had designed for no flair, no press, and no ego, Isaiah Thomas stood before a small group of representatives from other industries, banking, tech, hospitality, logistics. All of them had requested private sessions, quiet coaching, guidance. Because what happened to Falconer had revealed something terrifying to them: the illusion of control. If one slap could lead to the unraveling of an entire structure, what could happen if people began to look inward? Darius didn't posture during these sessions. He didn't make threats or issue ultimatums. Instead, he shared blueprints, real tested models of power, decentralization, cultural equity reviews, and leadership scorecards tied not to profit but to humanity. "We're not replacing leaders," he told them. "We're recalibrating the values that define leadership." That phrase, recalibrating values, would later be quoted in a Harvard Business Review article titled The King Doctrine, a breakdown of how post-crisis power structures could be intentionally and ethically redistributed. But in real time, the shift was slower, less headline-worthy, more foundational. At Falconer, a new rule was instituted. Every executive hiring panel required a non-executive voting member. That meant janitors could vote on who became their next department VP. That meant junior flight attendants had a say in the future of customer service leadership. And with that rule, power stopped flowing from the top down. It began moving in circles. For Carl Tress, the reversal of power was not a media spectacle. It was quiet, humiliating, and absolute. He had disappeared after the incident, reportedly traveling to a private family property out of state. When contacted by legal authorities for testimony in a pending civil inquiry, he declined invoking counsel. But the world didn't forget. His name was etched into the origin of the most significant corporate transformation in recent airline history, not as a cautionary tale, but as the last gasp of a failing mindset, a mindset that believed control was a birthright, not a responsibility. His FAA license was revoked. His name flagged on no-hire lists across the major U.S. carriers. When he tried applying for a private aviation role, the recruiter noted simply, "We don't work with ghosts." He faded from the industry. And yet Darius never spoke his name again, because the point wasn't vengeance. It was inversion, letting the weight of his own actions collapse on itself while Darius built something that would outlive every apology. Elsewhere, stories emerged: quiet, brave, undeniable. A gay black flight attendant from Cleveland, who had once been reprimanded for refusing to change his hair for uniform cohesion, was now chairing Falconer's appearance bias task force. A Filipina gate agent, who had been forced to use an anglicized name tag for customer ease, now had her real name engraved into the company's new employee honor wall. And perhaps most telling of all, Darius himself took a commercial flight for the first time since the incident. Coach class, middle seat, not for symbolism, for accountability. He wanted to see firsthand if the system had really changed when no one thought he was watching. The results, small but real. A flight attendant offered him his correct meal without asking twice. A crew member greeted him by name, not because he was famous, but because he was logged in the system as a respected Apex partner. The cabin crew treated the elderly passenger beside him with dignity, even after she spilled her water twice. No grand gestures, no photo ops, just competence, respect, decency. When the flight landed, the captain didn't know he had carried a man whose leadership had redefined the industry. And Darius preferred it that way. Because the real sign of power reversal wasn't applause. It was normalization. The things that once felt like exceptions being heard, seen, and served with dignity were becoming standard. And those who once clung to power now sat quietly watching the future walk past them. The Falconer boardroom no longer looked like it had in the old days. Gone were the stiff chairs arranged in militant rows, the sterile lighting that made skin tones look ashy, the oversized portraits of former CEOs lining the hallway, smiling men in identical blue suits, all cut from the same cloth, all echoing the same legacy. Now the room pulsed with a quiet vibrancy, not just in furniture or design, but in purpose. The long obsidian table remained, but it had been shortened. Round tables replaced side desks. Whiteboards framed the walls, already filled with handwritten notes, policy sketches, and red-circled questions like, who does this decision benefit? Where might it fail? Someone invisible. The most important change wasn't physical. It was seated at the head of the table. Isaiah Thomas Falconer's newly appointed Chief Equity Officer and Acting VP of Organizational Development reviewed the day's agenda with calm precision. At just 36, he was younger than nearly every executive who had preceded him. And he didn't walk into the room with power. He built it step by step, meeting by meeting, reform by reform. He wasn't the only new face. Across the table sat Tanya Reeves, no longer just a training supervisor, but now Director of Talent Integrity. Beside her was Akash Patel, a quiet analyst who'd once raised red flags about discriminatory hiring, but had been ignored. Now he led the company's predictive equity modeling team, using AI to proactively detect bias patterns in scheduling, customer treatment, and even performance reviews. And at the far end of the room, listening, always listening, was Leonard Grant. He had not resigned, not because he refused, but because the board voted for him to stay. Not as leader, as learner. a symbol of the necessary reckoning within their own hierarchy. Leonard no longer spoke first in meetings. Often, he didn't speak at all. It was a decision he and Darius King had agreed upon privately. Darius, for his part, remained exactly where he wanted to be outside the system, but with a direct line into its pulse. His consulting status remained active but unpaid. His conditions were clear from day one, I advise. I don't manage. My value ends the moment you stop listening. They never did. Weekly calls with Isaiah turned into late-night sessions. The topics ranged from executive pipeline analysis to customer feedback integration to building employee-led review panels with real authority. These weren't meetings designed to impress shareholders. They were designed to outlast them. Isaiah once asked him, "How do we know we're building the right structure?" Darius answered, "When the wrong people fear it and the right ones trust it." One of the first major changes under the new leadership was the overhaul of the Falconer Management Track program. Previously, promotions required referrals from senior executives and board endorsements. Now the process was blind reviewed, scored with anonymized project portfolios, and included peer assessments weighted higher than top-down appraisals. The result? Within 60 days, 4 new department leads were selected. 3 were women, 2 were black. One was formerly a crew supervisor dismissed years earlier for failing to uphold guest experience standards, a phrase long used to mask racial bias. Her name was Dr. Nadine Price. She held a doctorate in organizational psychology, and now she led guest services strategy for the entire North American division. In her first team-wide message, she wrote, "I wasn't promoted because I'm a symbol. I was promoted because someone like Darius opened the door and someone like Isaiah refused to close it." The shift wasn't just internal. Externally, Falconer's public engagement changed too. They launched an online portal, OpenJet, where passengers could view live updates on reforms, track complaint, resolution progress, and offer anonymous feedback about service discrimination or praise. The portal was independently moderated and audited quarterly by a coalition of civil rights groups. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever is. But it was real. Passengers began noticing. Customer reviews shifted from skepticism to cautious hope. Flight crews, once tight-lipped and defensive, started speaking with quiet pride. "I feel like I finally fly for the airline I thought I joined," said one attendant in a passenger feedback video. It wasn't scripted. That was the point. At Apex Tech, Darius reviewed the latest metrics from Falconer's restructuring initiative. Internal promotion equity had increased by 47%. Reported incidents of bias had dropped by 63%. Employee retention among minority groups had risen by 31%. Customer service satisfaction had exceeded pre-crisis levels for the first time since the incident. He read the numbers without celebration, then forwarded the report to a new email group he'd created, Black Leadership Roundtable, a collective of executives and strategists across industries who were quietly building their own infrastructure of power reform and legacy. In his message, he wrote, "This is how it begins, not with noise, but with structure. Not in anger, but in design." One evening at a staff event inside Falconer's remodeled hangar, Isaiah Thomas stood in front of a banner that read, "Culture is Leadership." He gave a short speech. No cue cards, no consultants, just memory. 3 months ago, we stood on the edge of collapse. Not because of bad press, but because of the truth finally being louder than our excuses. He paused. And we didn't survive because we were strong. We survived because someone stood in our blind spot and refused to move. He looked to the back of the room where Darius King stood quietly leaning against a wall, hands in pockets. Isaiah raised a glass. "To the ones who lead when no one's watching." Everyone turned, and for a moment, just a moment, the room held still. Not for applause, but for acknowledgement. New leadership had arrived, not with crowns, but with clarity. The work of reform is rarely glamorous. There are no red carpets for rewriting policy, no standing ovations for rethinking org charts. The applause that comes, if it comes at all, is the silence that follows meaningful change. A kind of stillness, a breath in the air, where people who were once afraid to speak finally start to believe that what they say might matter. That's what Falconer Air had begun to feel like. Not perfect, but possible. It started with the architecture of authority itself. Under the guidance of Isaiah Thomas and with strategic consultation from Darius King, Falconer initiated a complete institutional overhaul. Not just in language, but in structure. how decisions were made, who made them, and how accountability was enforced. The first target, human resources. The department was dissolved and rebuilt from scratch as the Office of People Equity and Integrity OPEI, an autonomous body with independent authority to review complaints, conduct investigations, and veto promotions that failed to meet ethical criteria. Every member of the OPEI was required to complete and pass a 90-day intensive certification in conflict resolution, workplace bias mitigation, and civil rights law, co-developed with national labor rights organizations. No exceptions. Even the chief of staff was required to attend. Within the first month, OPEI reopened 147 previously closed employee complaints. Of those, 46 were escalated for further investigation. 15 resulted in formal apologies. 9 led to policy amendments. 2 led to firings. Those numbers, once buried, now lived on a public dashboard updated every 2 weeks. Visibility wasn't a threat anymore. It was a mandate. The second tier of reform tackled promotion pathways. Falconer implemented a blind equity review process for all internal job transfers and leadership considerations. Applicants' names, departments, and demographic details were hidden. Review panels were selected randomly from certified staff across divisions, and decisions were audited quarterly by the Ethics Oversight Board. As a result, within 60 days, Falconer saw a 38% increase in the advancement of underrepresented employees into leadership tracks. More importantly, the transparency built trust that had never existed before. But perhaps the most symbolic shift came in the form of a physical space. On the 3rd floor of Falconer's main headquarters, a quiet corner once reserved for executive storage was converted into a permanent reflection room called the Listening Lounge. It wasn't a wellness gimmick. It was a room where any employee could walk in, scan a badge, and record via video, audio, or written form anything they wanted to say about culture, work ethics, or justice. The room was soundproofed, equipped with AI transcription tools, and linked directly to the OPEI review system. Nothing was deleted. Everything was archived. Every quarter, anonymized patterns from the lounge were shared publicly. It wasn't just revolutionary, it was, as one journalist put it, the company's conscience built into its blueprint. Outside the walls of Falconer, institutional reform began catching on. Within 2 months, 3 other major airlines sent internal representatives to observe Falconer's restructuring model. One of them, Sky Atlas, publicly credited Falconer for influencing its own shift toward ethical promotion boards. Even international companies began to reach out. Aviation Week published a profile titled "The Blueprint for Ethical Flight: How One Scandal Remade an Industry." In it, Isaiah Thomas was quoted, "Reform isn't about who gets fired. It's about what gets changed so no one needs to be fired again." Darius King has always watched from the periphery, but nothing escaped his view. He reviewed every OPA report. He mentored rising leaders quietly. He challenged protocols, demanded metrics, and reminded everyone that reform wasn't something you announce. It's something you repeat over and over until it becomes normal. In a private strategy session with Falconer's CEO and external auditors, Darius drew a circle on the whiteboard. At its center, he wrote one word: culture. Then a ring around it: policy. Then a final outer layer: perception. If you change perception before policy, he said, you get PR. If you change policy before culture, you get backlash. But if you change culture first, the rest follows and sticks. The room was silent. Then the CEO simply nodded. We start with the center. And they did. One of the most innovative reforms came from a suggestion submitted through the Listening Lounge by a junior gate agent named Bria Winston. She proposed a real-time bias interruption protocol, a protocol that allowed any employee mid-shift to pause a customer interaction they believed to be escalating due to discrimination. The protocol triggered a supervisory review, real-time coaching, and protected the employee from punitive response. It was implemented within weeks. In the first 30 days, it was used 27 times. In 24 of those cases, supervisors agreed with the employee's call. Bias, once shrugged off or dismissed as customer is always right, was now part of the operational dialogue. In Bria, she was promoted to lead culture coach in less than 3 months. As spring arrived, so did a wave of applications from across the industry. Not because Falconer was paying more, because people believed in what they were building. Pilots, engineers, analysts, ground crew, flight attendants from other airlines who'd once rolled their eyes at the name Falconer were now asking how they could join, because reform had become a magnet, not a punishment, And the organization that once slapped a black CEO had become a case study in how to listen when silence used to rule. The building looked the same, but inside the walls breathed with accountability, and the rooms echoed not with fear, but with voices that had finally found a home. It began slowly. A few posts, a few shares, a few quiet nods of recognition on social media. Then it spread. People who had never flown Falcon Air before were talking about it not because of luxury upgrades or flashy marketing, but because of something deeper. They saw something they rarely witnessed in corporate America, a company owning its failure and changing from within. The slap that silenced a cabin had awakened a conversation far louder than any press release. Darius King hadn't needed to shout. He didn't call for boycotts. He didn't flood timelines with hashtags. He simply moved calmly, quietly, and with purpose. And the world watched. On TikTok, a young flight attendant named Luis posted a video stitched with the original footage of the aftermath, now overlaid with clips of his own Falcon Air crew briefing. In it, his manager read from a new employee empowerment protocol. Luis's caption said it all. "A year ago, I was afraid to report anything. Today, I was told I have a voice. That's because someone refused to stay quiet." The clip gained 4 million views in 2 days. In Seattle, a diversity consultant posted a thread. "For once, we're not seeing a company defend the indefensible. We're watching one tear down the wall it built and start fresh." Falcon Air's reforms aren't performative. They're procedural. That's the difference. And in Atlanta, during a panel discussion on race and leadership, a black woman in her 60s stood up, tears in her eyes, and said, "I've lived long enough to know when a system changes for real. I saw a man get struck and stand taller than the tower that hit him. And now they're building rooms where our kids can speak without fear." That's not just change. That's a shift. It wasn't just social media. Churches began referencing the story in sermons about dignity and justice. Community centers hosted town halls about workplace safety. High school ethics teachers used the story as a case study on moral leadership. A local college added it to their organizational behavior course under a unit titled Silent Power: How Grace Reforms Systems. And then came the letters, hundreds of them, from retired military veterans, from single mothers, from college students, from former Falcon Air passengers. Each one different, but all threaded with a common theme. I saw myself in that seat. One handwritten letter sent to Apex Tech's headquarters simply read, "I didn't know people like us could win without yelling." Darius didn't answer every letter, but he read every single one. And one afternoon, sitting in his office with sunlight falling across the marble floor, he turned to Corey, his assistant, and said, "We didn't change a company. We changed how people see their own silence." Corey nodded, "And their power." At Falcon Air's main terminal in Chicago, a new installation appeared beside the check-in counters. A glass column filled with paper strips, each one a printed quote from employees, passengers, or public letters submitted to the listening lounge. The column was called "Voices That Weren't Heard Now Held." It wasn't a memorial. It was a reminder. A reminder that institutional reform means little if it never reaches the ground. And on the ground, passengers noticed. They noticed how staff responded with presence, not performative politeness, but authentic engagement. They noticed how the training brochures visible in the seatbacks now included resources on discrimination reporting, printed in 4 languages. They noticed how diverse the flight crews had become, not just in look, but in leadership. A young mother named Grace, flying with her biracial son for the first time, posted, "When I boarded, I was scared. When we landed, I cried, because my son was treated like a future leader, not a liability." National news outlets began shifting the narrative. What began as a headline of outrage was now a full-fledged cultural movement. The Darius Effect read a Time magazine cover, "The slap that sparked a systemic awakening." Inside an op-ed by activist and educator Dr. Nadira Holmes wrote, "For years, we've begged systems to see us, protect us, and believe us. But we've also learned that systems don't change when they're screamed at. They change when someone knows how to quietly pull every thread until the whole thing reshapes." She ended with a quote from Darius himself, pulled from an internal Apex memo: "We don't flip tables. We rebuild them wider, stronger, and with seats for those long kept standing." In one final unexpected moment of clarity, a news anchor closed a segment about Falcon Air with this reflection: "What makes this story different isn't that justice was loud. It's that dignity was louder. And with that, the public finally understood this wasn't a scandal, it was a mirror. And the reflection had forced everyone to ask, what kind of world are we building when silence is rewarded? And who do we become when someone chooses not to stay silent? Falcon Air's collapse and resurrection didn't just shift its own trajectory, it reverberated across an entire industry that had long prided itself on consistency, tradition, and status quo. For decades, the airline business had operated like a closed, sky-regulated, risk-averse, and guarded by legacy relationships. Change when it came was slow, usually in response to profit margins or mechanical efficiency, rarely because of people. But now, after one slap in a luxury cabin, everything was under review. The industry had seen controversies before union strikes, delayed compensation scandals, viral customer service fiascos, but this was different. This wasn't about customer inconvenience. It was about human dignity. And it had been handled not with empty apologies or spin, but with full systemic exposure. That made other airline executives nervous. If Falcon Air could unravel so quickly over a single passenger incident, what skeletons were hiding in their own overhead compartments? At Sky Atlas Airlines, the CEO summoned a private task force 2 weeks after Falcon Air's first public reforms were announced. They called it Project Horizon. Publicly, they were reviewing inclusive travel experiences. Privately, they were examining over 300 customer complaints from the past 5 years, all of which had been closed without investigation. One internal Slack message, leaked by an employee, read, "We need to Falcon-proof this company before the next Darius walks through our door." At Goldwind Aviation, a top-tier executive demanded her staff submit an optics analysis of all crew member disciplinary actions broken down by race and gender. When the analysis revealed that over 80% of written warnings had been given to non-white employees, despite only comprising 40% of the staff, she quietly froze all further penalties pending review. The message was clear. Fix the pattern before the pattern becomes the headline. Even the ultra-luxury charter airlines began to stir. One high-profile executive at Jetverse, speaking anonymously to Aviation Today, confessed, "We've long believed exclusivity meant discretion. But now we're realizing that exclusivity without accountability is just a ticking clock." To address concerns before they became crises, Jetverse hired a civil rights compliance consultant for the first time in company history. Their first internal report revealed that in the last calendar year, only 2 of the 97 elite chartered flights were captained by women or pilots of color. That figure didn't get published. But it sparked a company-wide overhaul in crew assignment algorithms and flight director hiring panels. Meanwhile, transportation unions across the country began citing Falcon Air as leverage. A coalition of black flight attendants submitted a formal petition to the National Aviation Equity Board demanding federally mandated anti-bias audits for all commercial airlines. Their petition opened with one sentence: "It shouldn't take a slap in a CEO to make safety systemic." It was signed by over 9,000 aviation workers within 48 hours. Suddenly, government officials, many of whom had ignored equity proposals in the past, were paying attention. One congressional hearing initially scheduled to address pilot shortage concerns pivoted mid-session when a senator held up a printed article titled, "The Darius Doctrine, Quiet Power, Loud Results." "I don't want to talk about hiring gaps," the senator said. "I want to talk about dignity gaps." Airports themselves began evolving. At Logan International in Boston, a new policy was rolled out requiring all airport staff, TSA agents, baggage handlers, and customer service reps to complete a 5-hour de-escalation and anti-bias certification before being cleared for front-facing positions. The training module was developed in partnership with the same consultants who had helped rebuild Falcon Air's cultural framework. At LAX, an anonymous staff initiative was introduced: Operation Flight Fairness, live emails in ground handling tactics, a digital whistleblowing system modeled after Falcon Air's listening lounge. Its results were immediate. Within 3 weeks, 5 incidents of crew discrimination were flagged and resolved internally without PR fallout, but with swift procedural adjustments. It was working. And across terminals, in the break rooms, where change once felt like fantasy, airline workers were speaking about dignity the same way they once spoke about flight delays and boarding zones. Even aviation schools began rethinking. At the National Institute for Aviation Management, a new seminar was introduced: Ethics in the Sky, From Scandal to Structure. Case Study 1, Falconer. The seminar walks students through the entire chain of events, from the slap to the reform to the industry's collective reaction. The final project asks students to answer one question. What would you have done differently if you were in charge? And what systems would you build to make sure no one else ever has to ask that again? For the first time in school history, the class filled to capacity in under an hour. And as the ripple continued outward, Darius King remained exactly where he wanted to be, out of the spotlight, but in the blueprint. He declined interviews, declined keynotes, but the industry couldn't stop invoking his name. Airline equity forums began referencing King compliance, a term coined to describe corporate procedures that protected dignity before damage control. HR executives whispered the phrase like scripture, "Would this pass a King audit?" And while Darius never claimed credit for what came next, he understood the weight of what he'd triggered. This wasn't about punishing companies. It was about forcing them to confront their myths. That safety equaled fairness. That reputation equaled truth. That silence equaled peace. He had proven otherwise. And now an industry once cloaked in tradition was learning a new flight path. One paved not in platinum lounge privileges, but in listening. It had been 6 months since the slap heard around the world. 6 months of internal audits, resignations, sweeping reform, and an industry forced to face its own reflection. And still there was one truth yet to emerge fully into the light. One final wound, not yet named, not yet treated, not until now. The exposure began ironically not from Darius King, not from Falconer, but from a woman no one had been watching. Her name was Erin Halbrook. She had served as Falconer's Director of Internal Compliance for nearly a decade. Her office had no windows. Her job required her to sign forms, suppress noise, and make sure nothing too volatile reached the boardroom. She was good at it, until she couldn't be. The slap broke something in her. Not because she was surprised she wasn't, but because she realized she had become part of the machinery that made such a thing inevitable. For years, she'd flagged complaints, raised concerns, even privately questioned Carl Tress's behavior. But every time someone higher up smoothed things over, reassured her, promised it was being handled, so she stopped asking, until Darius's story went public, until his silent composure turned the volume up on every silent failure she had ever signed off on. And so Erin Halbrook made a choice. She came forward. First to OPEI, the newly formed Office of People, Equity, and Integrity inside Falconer, then to a federal investigator, and finally to the public. Her 64-page sworn testimony, released through a protected civil rights firm, was called The Paper Trail to Prejudice: How We Institutionalize Silence. It detailed everything. The coded language used in Carl's performance reviews to justify retention, command presence, traditional guest-facing style, firm demeanor. The redirection of complaints involving passengers of color to a secondary feedback queue where they would receive personalized follow-up, which translated to no follow-up at all. The 2017 memo circulated among senior staff instructing HR to scrutinize complaints that reference racial bias more rigorously to prevent external escalation. The watch list quietly maintained for employees considered culture agitators, nearly all of them non-white or LGBTQ+. The release dropped like a detonator. Within 24 hours, major outlets ran headlines: "The Culture File Falconer's Internal Playbook for Suppressing Bias. Red flags in blue skies." She was told to shred the complaints, she kept them. The most damning part: Erin had receipts, email chains, memos, a hidden folder she'd kept on her encrypted drive labeled "just in case." She had not leaked them to punish. She had leaked them to finish what Darius started. To show that the slap wasn't a glitch, it was a program, and that it had been written, enforced, and protected by people like her until someone chose to expose it. At Apex Tech, Darius received a direct copy of the report from Erin's legal team. He read it alone, then sent only 3 words to Isaiah Thomas at Falconer. "You were right," because Isaiah had said from the start, "This isn't about Carl, it's about the code that created Carl." Now the code had been cracked. The fallout was swift. The Department of Transportation announced a full federal review into Falconer's vendor and labor practices over the last 10 years. Airlines that had shared hiring databases or scheduling contracts with the Falconer were now roped into the investigation. Class action suits were filed. 6 former Falconer executives received subpoenas. Leonard Grant voluntarily stepped down from the board, submitting a letter that began, "I led during an era where silence was synonymous with stability. I now understand that silence was the threat." Even employees who had once tried to keep their heads down began speaking. A veteran pilot confessed on a company message board, "I used to think culture was someone else's job. Now I know it's part of every pre-flight check." And in one unfiltered post that went viral, a junior employee wrote, "We didn't just fly blind. We flew believing the sky belonged to someone else, not anymore." As for Erin Halbrook, she didn't return to Falconer. She didn't sign a book deal. She moved to Vermont, took a job as a policy advisor at a nonprofit focused on corporate transparency, and refused every interview request. But she sent one final message to Darius King. It read, "I was silent too long. Bye-bye. Thank you for making truth louder than shame." And Darius, he didn't hold a press conference. But inside Apex Tech during a quiet internal meeting, he asked his team to pause before launching their next initiative. He stood, walked to the board, and wrote a single phrase: "Every system protects itself until someone changes the terms." No one in the room spoke, because they understood. The exposure was not just the end of a chapter, it was the moment the old flight plan burned. And a new one began. There was no parade, no national ceremony, no honorary plaque with gold inlay. There was only the steady hum of ordinary life returning and changing. Darius King stood at Gate 14 of Eastbridge International Airport alone, unaccompanied, dressed in a navy peacoat and gray slacks. In one hand, a carry-on. In the other, a slim black envelope containing nothing but a boarding pass. Economy class. He wasn't here to make a point. He was here to watch, to feel the system he had helped remake without alerting it. No one recognized him. No one whispered. No phones came out. Just a group of strangers shuffling toward a flight, yawning, checking watches, texting loved ones about delays and dinner plans. And that was the victory, because real justice doesn't always arrive with a crescendo. Sometimes it lands silently. As Darius boarded the plane, a Falconer Airbus A320, he scanned the crew. A young Latina flight attendant greeted him with a smile that wasn't forced. "Good morning, sir. 14B is just past the wing." He nodded, thanked her, and moved on. Midway through the cabin, he noticed the new crew handbook tucked into the wall pocket beside the safety card. Its spine was stamped with a gold emblem, "Culture and Practice." Inside were pages that included rights for both passengers and staff escalation pathways, and a reminder printed in bold near the back. Every seat holds a human. Every uniform wears a history. Treat both with care. Darius exhaled quietly, feeling the words more than reading them. In Chicago, back at Falconer headquarters, Isaiah Thomas stood in his new corner office. Not grand, not oversized, but functional. Behind him was a wall of sticky notes, hundreds of them, each written by staff who had submitted anonymous ideas over the past 3 months. Some notes were angry, some were hopeful, some were just tired, but all of them were voices once silenced. Isaiah wasn't collecting them for inspiration. He was collecting them for accountability. Across the room, Tanya Reeves knocked once before entering. "They approved the next hiring round," she said. "Majority came through the blind review panel. First time that's ever happened." Isaiah nodded. "They're ready. They're already here. Just waiting on your word." He smiled faintly. "Then give it. No announcement needed, just motion." Down in Miami, a Falconer ground crew member named Alton Jackson received a surprise email he'd been selected for the new Leadership Rising program. Years ago, Alton had been passed over 3 times for shift supervisor. Once he'd been told he wasn't polished enough. Today, his supervisor wrote, "We see you now. Not just your hands, but your insight." Alton wept quietly in the locker room, then texted his teenage daughter, "They're finally listening. You were right not to let me quit." In Seattle, an elderly passenger boarded a Falconer flight with her emotional support dog. She had filed a complaint 3 years prior after being mocked by a flight crew for making a fuss. That complaint had disappeared. This time she was greeted at the gate with a staff member holding a water bowl and a small welcome card for the pup. Inside the envelope was a note, "We read your letter. We remember." Back at Apex Tech, Darius returned to his office after the flight. He didn't mention it to anyone. He just placed the used boarding pass in a drawer marked notes. Then he sat and reviewed a package that had arrived while he was gone, the final implementation report from Falconer's year-long culture overhaul. The first page included new policies, employee stats, and hiring data. But the last page was blank except for a quote handwritten in blue ink. It read, "You didn't just reroute the plane, you rebuilt the runway." It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. Later that week, during a private executive roundtable, a young CEO asked Darius, "Why didn't you take credit for the reforms? You could have written a book, built a media empire, people would have followed." Darius looked at him for a long moment and replied, "I don't want followers. I want systems that don't need saving in the first place." The room fell silent. He stood. "I didn't need to be right. I needed the structure to be different when I walked away." And then he did walk away. The following month, the Equal Opportunity Enforcement Board released a national report on post-crisis corporate accountability. In the final appendix, Falconer was listed under reform leaders. Beside the entry, independent review confirms sustained changes in culture compliance and leadership equity, model now adopted in 4 additional industries. There was no footnote about Darius King, no bolded paragraph, no summary of the slap, just a new standard, in place, working, quietly, like victory should. The storm had passed, not forgotten, but passed. What remained now was not fire or fury, but framework. Systems had changed, policies had shifted. Faces once silenced now sat at decision-making tables. And yet the true legacy of what happened aboard Flight 1621 wasn't written in press releases or policy updates. It lived in the way people moved, in the way they spoke with more thought, more weight, more clarity, in the way silence no longer equaled safety. It lived in the air, and that more than anything was Darius King's legacy. In the heart of Washington, D.C., beneath the grand marble dome of the Smithsonian Museum of American History, preparations were underway for a new exhibit, Flight and Justice: Skies That Changed Us. It wasn't a flashy exhibit. No holograms, no soundtracks. Just a curated collection of airline uniforms, boarding passes, in-flight manuals, and one central display, a single unused meal tray with a folded napkin that read, "It was never just about the food." Next to it in glass was the transcript of Darius King's emergency intercom call from that flight. "This is Darius King. I need to speak with the captain immediately. We need to land this plane." For most visitors, it would read like a moment of escalation. But to those who had lived through the last year, it was the sentence that grounded an entire culture of avoidance. In boardrooms across the country, the ripple was still moving. Executive leadership courses now included modules on crisis to culture transition, with Falconer cited as a rare success story in corporate redemption. An airline once seen as symbolic of unchecked elitism was now the model for bottom-up accountability. At one such training event, a CEO from a logistics conglomerate stood during Q&A and said, "We've updated our protocols, sure, but how do we know we've done enough?" The instructor answered without hesitation, "When people no longer rely on heroes to be heard." That was Darius's impact, not to be the hero, but to remove the need for one. At Apex Tech, the office walls still carried the quiet pulse of his leadership. His portrait was never hung, his name never etched in a lobby plaque. But among staff junior to senior, his influence was understood. Every time a team member flagged a procedural flaw, every time someone challenged a biased assumption in a product meeting, every time a hiring manager double-checked themselves before dismissing a non-traditional candidate, that was legacy in motion. The internal Slack channel, Quiet Power, created months ago by a mid-level engineer, had become a hub for reflection and reform. People posted ideas, patterns they'd noticed, moments they'd corrected without fear of reprisal. In the pinned post at the top of the thread, a quote from Darius: "Your silence isn't neutrality, it's an invitation. Ask what you're inviting." Meanwhile, Falconer's transformation continued, led by new blood, grounded by new standards. Every new hire attended a 1-week onboarding course called the Listening Academy, led by real staff who'd lived through the company's darkest hours. Their stories weren't softened. They weren't scripted. They were testimonies. And on the last day of training, each employee was handed a small pin, a miniature silver wing, engraved with a single word on the back: "Seen." Isaiah Thomas, now president of Cultural Systems and Development, called it the company's new fuel. "We fly because we are seen," he told a new class of hires, not in spite of it. And what of Darius? He had stepped back from day-to-day involvement, quietly declined further advisory roles, stopped speaking at forums. He didn't want to become an icon. He wanted to disappear into the system he had helped repair and let it speak for itself. But his work lived on. At a community college in Newark, a freshman class debated the ethics of leadership using his case. At a legal reform think tank, his response structure was studied as a conflict resolution prototype. In a poetry anthology on modern protest, his intercom call was printed verbatim beside Langston Hughes. And in a children's book called When Skies Speak, written from the perspective of a young girl on Flight 1621 who witnessed it all, Darius was drawn simply dark suit, calm eyes, standing up when no one else did. The dedication read, "For those who lead with silence and change everything with it." Back in Eastbridge, in a modest bookstore tucked between a coffee shop and a pharmacy, Darius browsed quietly one evening. The cashier, a young black man, paused when he recognized him. He didn't say anything, he just nodded. Darius nodded back. No fanfare, just recognition. Legacy isn't always carved in stone or stitched into metals. Sometimes it's the quiet policy that protects someone you'll never meet. Sometimes it's the courage someone finds because you once stood when they couldn't. Sometimes it's knowing that systems like airplanes don't fly because one engine roars. They fly because every part seen or unseen agrees. We move forward, together. 6 months after the world watched a black CEO absorb a slap at 35,000 feet and turn it into a nationwide reckoning, Darius King sat alone at the edge of Lake Monroe. It was early, quiet. The kind of morning where fog dances low over the water and even the birds hesitate before speaking. He had no phone, no laptop, no pending lawsuits or policy memos in front of him. Only stillness. He watched the ripples stretch from the shoreline, each one soft, persistent, unapologetic. Just like the movement he'd helped build. Not loud, not viral, just undeniable. That's what real change looks like. Not in courtroom headlines or company slogans, but in culture shifts that don't ask for permission. In the last few months, the world had moved on. The media frenzy faded. The hashtags cooled. But something deeper remained. A realignment. A recalibration. A set of new rules quietly rewriting the old ones, not just in Falconer, but in boardrooms, classrooms, airport terminals, and living rooms. And that Darius knew was the only legacy worth having. Back in Chicago at Falconer HQ, Isaiah Thomas led a briefing in the newly renamed Justice Room, a glass-walled space where every major policy decision now had to pass a review for equity and impact. No more hidden agendas. No more passive silence. The room was symbolic, but the impact was real. "We're not perfect," Isaiah said to his team, "but we're present, and that's the difference." One wall held photos of current leaders. Another wall held names of past victims, employees, and passengers alike, whose complaints had once been buried. Not anymore. Now they lived here, etched into the company's walls, part of the memory Falconer refused to forget. At Apex Tech, an intern from Howard University asked Darius a question during a quiet lunch. "How do you know when you've won?" Darius stirred his tea and said, "You don't." Then he smiled. "You just know you've made it harder for someone else to lose." The intern paused, then nodded like he'd heard something he would carry for decades. Because legacy isn't what's remembered, it's what's repeated. Elsewhere, ripple effects continued. A flight attendant at a rival airline challenged her manager for suggesting certain types of passengers should be watched more closely. Instead of being disciplined, she was promoted and told her challenge had become part of a new employee handbook section titled "Every Passenger Counts." At a tech firm in Silicon Valley, an executive cited Darius King's quiet leadership when rolling out a new company-wide listening program for marginalized staff. And in a speech before Congress, Senator Roland Pierce said, "We can legislate compliance, but only stories like Mr. King's can legislate conscience." That line made the room go silent. The world hadn't changed because of outrage. It changed because Darius refused to answer violence with vengeance. He answered with vision. He didn't burn down the building. He rebuilt the foundation while everyone else was still staring at the smoke. Back at Lake Monroe, Darius stood and walked along the dock. He thought of the first time he ever boarded a plane as a young man, just 21, a fresh grad with a cheap suit and a loan-funded briefcase. He'd been seated in the very last row next to the lavatory. The attendant that day never once looked him in the eye. He remembered how small he'd felt, how invisible. And now he'd built a world where someone like that version of himself wouldn't feel that way again. That was the victory. No parades, no statues, just a little more dignity in the air. A week later, he received a letter, handwritten, unassuming, no return address. Inside one sentence, because of you, I stayed. And I'm changing things from the inside now. That was it. That was enough. Legacy isn't built in press conferences or courtroom showdowns. It's built in policies that protect strangers, in silence that is no longer dangerous, in courage that doesn't need cameras. Darius King never raised his voice. He raised a standard. And long after the headlines disappeared, that standard remained. Upright, unshaken, unignorable. Because some men don't chase power. They redefine how it's used. If you found this story powerful, subscribe to Real Life Stories New for more narratives that expose injustice and celebrate quiet revolutions. The world is changing. Be part of the reason why.